Welcome you to Butler Chapel for this another very special event as we are going through the week building in anticipation for the installation of Dr. Creed as our fifth president here at Campbell. We are excited tonight to welcome to our campus a very fine scholar, Dr. Wayne Flynt. Dr. Flynt, I just a personal word about him. I have known Dr. Flynt for probably 15 or 20 years through Baptist history circles. We have been at a number of different Baptist history meetings together, and he is just such an engaging person to talk to. It's always been my privilege to be around him and to enjoy conversation with him. He has a fascinating career where he has done work primarily in the area of Southern history, but the specialization that he is focused upon in the area of Southern history is Southern religion. And he will be very quick to tell you that you can't study Southern history and Southern religion without also studying Southern literature. And so he is something of an expert in all of those subsets within Southern history, and so he's just a fascinating person to talk to. Just in the last 5 minutes, I discovered something new about him. He is very close friends with one of the best professors that I ever had in my life, one of my history professors in my undergraduate work at Mars Hill College, Dr. Harley Jolly, and Dr. Flynt were good friends in graduate school, and I never knew of that connection. So we are in for a real treat tonight as we listen to Dr. Flynt as he shares with us. You can see a little bit of information about Dr. Flynt on the back of your programs. I will tell you that he received his Bachelor of Arts degree at Howard College in the area of history and speech. He was a ministerial student when he went to college, and the ministry has never been very far away from him. He is very active in the Baptist tradition and in his local church, and he's even done some preaching every now and then. And so he was educated with his BA degree in history and speech at Howard College, and then he did the MA and the PhD at Florida State University in the area of history. He is the author of 11 books. We have several of his books back on the table in the foyer. We hope that you will take the opportunity to purchase those. He will be signing those after the lecture. If you're interested in buying one, getting him to sign it for you, he'll be glad to do that. He will also take some questions and answers after his presentation this evening. And just as a side note, for those of you that are students and you're here for extra credit or something like that, we'll sign all of those things at the end of the program tonight. So I hope that you will join me in giving a very warm welcome now to Dr. Wayne Flynt.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Can you all hear me okay? For those of you who are University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill basketball fans, there is no more devoted basketball fan in America than I am. I even once fancied myself when I was playing Auburn City League basketball as being a pretty short, thin, white guy with the soul of Charles Barkley. And Charles, though not the greatest student in the world, was actually an incredibly bright student, and you can certainly tell that in his interviews. So loving college basketball like I do, you will not be here at 9 o'clock, nor will I be here at 9 o'clock tonight. I actually thought that my friend Brad Creed had sabotaged me by scheduling me to speak tonight of all time, and it would thin the crowd considerably. And thank the Lord for scheduling this game in Houston, where it starts late, instead of on the East Coast, where it would have probably started while I was speaking. By the way, I have a grievance against all of you, because I'm a member of the Board of Overseers students at Samford University, and you stole one of the best administrators we have ever had at Samford, who is absolutely beloved by my son, who's a feature writer for Samford University, and my daughter-in-law, who is a Roman archaeologist and a member of the classics department. And they have told me when I got here to chide you severely about taking away their favorite Samford administrator. But you've got a real jewel, and you're going to learn to love him as much as the Samford folks, including the Board of Overseers, love him. Okay, so that's taking care of the preliminaries. On the 14th of October, 2014, my wife and I drove to Monroeville, Alabama for our monthly visit with Nell Harper Lee. Since her stroke in the spring of 2007, we had made this pilgrimage on average once a month, sometimes twice a month, at least for 9 years. So there are literally 100 plus visits and 300 pages of journal entries, because I keep a daily journal, and so I would record the conversations with her. In that particular conversation, as we entered Metta's assisted living and walked in her very small apartment, which she almost never left except for meals, I saw sitting on her ottoman a very large book, a tome. And because she had macular degeneration, the lettering on the book was very large, so I could read it all the way across the room. The collected works of C.S. Lewis. And although we know her well and had corresponded with her and knew her sisters and heard limitless stories about the family, I had no idea she was a C.S. Lewis fan. So when I saw the volume, I said, "Nell, I did not know you liked C.S. Lewis." To which she responded, "Greatest Christian apologist of the 20th century." I said, "Really? What's your favorite C.S. Lewis book?" She said, "Mere Christianity, greatest work of apologetics since St. Augustine." Well, church historians might quibble. There might have been one or two really fine works between St. Augustine and C.S. Lewis, but there aren't many that match Mere Christianity. And just to test her, I said, she tests me all the time by quoting Shakespeare, and my wife, who's an English major, always remembers the character and the line, what play it's from. I never remember. So she tortured me about this. So I thought, well, this is my get-even time. And since I'd read most of C.S. Lewis, I said, "And what else have you read other than Mere Christianity?" She said, "Oh, Screw Tape Letters, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe." Then she goes through the Narnia series, and then The Grief Observed, and on and on she goes. Finally, I said, okay, that's enough. I know you've read C.S. Lewis. Those of you who have read C.S. Lewis, and particularly for those in theology and religion, you know that there is a theological arc in the work of C.S. Lewis. So you start over here with innocence, childhood, and then you move to temptation, adolescence, then you move to sin, then you move to judgment, then you move from alienation, alienation from each other, alienation from children, alienation from parents, alienation from God, and rupture with home, whatever home means to you. You leave home in a profoundly theological way because of this arc of theology you've traveled on. Then for some, there is a rupture that is never resolved. For others, there's a rupture that leads to confrontation. That is, you don't want to leave home. You don't want to have this rupture turn into a lifetime experience. And so you go back and you confront the one from whom you're alienated, and you try to find ground that'll allow you to resolve the conflict. If this is successful, you have forgiveness and you have reconciliation. And it's curious that since Go Set a Watchman was published, shortly after the events of the A.M.E. Zion Mother Church in Charleston, South Carolina, we have been prepared to understand this book the way we understood her first book, or her second book, To Kill a Mockingbird, which followed on the cusp of the civil rights movement and which was understood for a generation as a civil rights book, a race book. However, when the book sold more than 40 million copies, and most of those overseas, in which the race issue was not our race issue, we began to understand that the takeaway of To Kill a Mockingbird is not altogether about race. It is, to a considerable extent, about the subject that President Barack Obama explained to Jewish students at Tel Aviv University in the second year of his administration, where he said, "Those of you who are Jewish in Tel Aviv must understand that if you're ever going to resolve the Palestinian issue, then you have to get inside their skin and walk in their shoes." Sound familiar? You might also be interested in knowing that the third year of his administration, he was seen on TV in a small bookstore at Martha's Vineyard buying a birthday gift for his daughter Malika. And when he came out of the bookstore with the bag, the reporter said, "What did you buy, Mr. President?" He said, "I bought a gift for my daughter Malika's birthday." The reporter said, "What book did you buy?" He said, "I bought To Kill a Mockingbird." So this is a book about otherness, and maybe the star of the novel is in fact not Atticus Finch, but Boo Radley, the eternal other, the outsider, the one who's never quite understood. The reason I tell you this about the conversation is because 3.5 months later, on the 3rd of February 2015, I was on my way home from having breakfast with a new member of my Sunday school class when I turned on National Public Radio, and Lynn Nearing, who incidentally had interviewed me 2 years early to talk about the death of Nell Harper Lee, because you sometimes record the death of a celebrity for NPR for their phone archive, and then if they can't get in touch with you the day she dies, they play your tape. Did you know that? And did you know that the biggest problem you have trying to do that interview is because you keep talking about Nell in the present tense rather than in the past tense? Because when I recorded the eulogy to her on NPR, she was still alive and would be alive for 2 more years. So Lynn Nearing, who had recorded the obituary I'd given 2 years before she died, when she's still alive now, said a new novel by Harper Lee has been discovered and would be published in July 2015. I did not know this, so I hurried home, told my wife that there was exciting news that a new novel by Harper Lee had been discovered. And that was the 3rd of February. On the 5th of February, my wife and I drove to have brunch, which we had already scheduled weeks earlier, with the person whom I'd asked to write the biography of Harper Lee for the online Encyclopedia of Alabama, which I edit. I mean, what irony. 2 days after the announcement of the book, and we're sitting there talking about, she didn't know about it, I didn't know about it. And we're talking about what in the world could this book be about. At that point, with brunch over, we returned to Auburn, and as I walk in the door, the phone rings. I answered the phone. It was a reporter wanting to talk about the new book. And when I put the phone back in its cradle, the phone rang again. I picked it up, and that occurred from 12:30 until 5:30 when we left for our midweek church service. And when I returned, there were 22 phone messages on the phone, and I answered them beginning at 6:30 and answered the last of those at 10:30, that is 9 hours on the phone, talking to reporters about Go Set a Watchman. The reason for this amazing interest was, of course, not just Harper Lee, not a new novel. It was the old novel, or the new novel, depending upon how you understand it. Remember, Go Set a Watchman, the new novel, was finished in 1956, and the old novel, which was actually the second novel to be written, was written between 1957, when the editor rejected Go Set a Watchman, and 1960, when it was published. So are you all confused now? The newest novel published is the first novel written. The second novel published is actually the old novel. And To Kill a Mockingbird is the new novel published 3 years after the old novel was submitted. So if you want to know what's on her mind in 1956, Go Set a Watchman's on her mind. If you want to know what's on her editor's mind, when her editor says, these are brilliant characterizations, Nell, Dill, and Scout are three of the most memorable characters in the history of American literature. So why don't you make them children, not adults, as you did in Go Set a Watchman? Why don't you put them in 1932, 33, 34, 35, when blacks knew their place? Not in 1956, when blacks had forgotten what their place was. And so she did. And the novel, which was originally published in a very small press run of 6,000 copies, and which Nell said, I assumed that my relatives in Monroeville and Monroe County would buy a substantial number of the volumes, and the rest would be found on remainder tables until they were finally sold out. Well, it turned out a little different. The volume, published in 6,000 copies, soon went into a book club publication, and then by the end of the year, millions were sold. And in the subsequent years, the novel sold more than 40 million copies in 40 languages and still sell roughly 1 million copies a year, more than 50 years after it was published. To give you something of the scope of this novel, between 1895 and 1975, period of 80 years, across mostly the 20th century, To Kill a Mockingbird was the third best-selling piece of fiction published in America. It was the seventh best-selling book of any genre, including the Bible, sold in America between 1995 and 1975. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1960, when the Library of Congress asked 5,000 patrons of that esteemed institution to name the piece of literature that had most affected their lives. They listed the Bible and To Kill a Mockingbird. By 1989, English teachers in American public high schools had To Kill a Mockingbird as the fourth most frequently required reading in English classes in American high schools. It was the fifth most recommended novel for parochial high schools, especially Catholic, the seventh best-selling and recommended piece of literature for private schools in America. And of the 10 top recommended authors, only one was a living author at the time, Nell Harper Lee. Number one was William Shakespeare, along with Jane Austen, her favorite writer. Number two was actually Mark Twain. Number three was Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Nell was number 4 in the composite averages of all the kinds of public high schools. In fact, so frequently did English teachers use the novel in their classes that I'm convinced that if you were attending school in America in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, or 90s, To Kill a Mockingbird is the single most unifying cultural icon in all of American culture. It was the one book, the one piece of literature or art or music where people could converse from one end of America to another because it was the one place where you had common knowledge. Just to test my theory, how many of you have read To Kill a Mockingbird? Just raise your hand. Look around, look around. Keep your hands out and look around. There is no novel, there is no piece of art, there's no piece of music I could list if I stayed here the rest of tonight and you missed the UNC Chapel Hill basketball game, trying to find a piece of literature or music or art where we could all say, yeah, we can have a conversation about that. Just to prove my point, the Library of Congress has what is called the Big Read program. And what they do is ask communities all across America to choose one piece of literature, and for a year, people in that community are asked to read that piece of literature in order to have a conversation across all the racial and socioeconomic barriers of that town about what it means to be an American, what democracy means, what community means. I bet you've already guessed that the most frequently used piece of literature for big reads all over the United States is To Kill a Mockingbird. I've done it in Brooklyn Public Library. I've done it at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. I've done it at the University of Vienna. I've done it from one end of America to another. And so this conversation can only happen because people have actually read the book. And that's one reason why she's sold 40 million copies of the book. So when reporters began to call, the reporters tended to ask these questions. Have you read the book? And my answer was, no, the book is embargoed until its publication, so I've not read the book. Now, they did cheat because I was doing so many sessions like this with so many audiences. So a week before the book appeared on the 14th of July, 2015, they sent me a copy of the book. So I knew what it was about by the time I was talking to reporters about it in Monroeville on the 14th, the day it was released. However, when the question was asked, have you read the book, I thought, I pretty much know what Alabama was like in 1956. So I think I may know what the book is about. But the clincher was this sentence. This is a one-sentence press release which Harper Collins and Heinemann Publishers, or a London publisher, that brought the book out. The one sentence at the end of February went like this. She, Jean Louise Finch, is forced to grapple with issues both personal and political as she tries to understand both her father's attitude towards society and her own feelings about the place where she was born and spent her childhood. Now, for reporters, that was just a piece of gobbledygook. What could it possibly mean? 26-year-old young woman who left Macomb, Monroeville, in 1949 and moved to New York. And 7 years later, she's going back to confront her town and society about something, but we don't have any idea what. Unless she wrote 9 books about Alabama in the 20th century, which I have, and therefore I had a hunch. I knew. So the really good reporters would press the issue. Incidentally, I keep a log of telephone calls and reporters' interviews. On the 3rd of February, I got a call from Lynn Neri in NPR, Reuters, London Times, London Daily Mail, London Guardian, London Independent, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, 3 different reporters from MSNBC, CBS News, ABC, and NBC. In subsequent days, El País, the largest Spanish language newspaper in the world, Der Spiegel, the largest German newspaper in Germany, the Sunday London Times, NewsHour, CNN, and an interview with Katie Couric in Monroeville, which gives you some idea of why this was such an important publication event, I would argue, along with Harry Potter, the most sensational publication event of the last half century. And so, when the reporter said, have you read the book? And I said, no. And they said, well, do you have any idea what the book's about? And I said, yes. They said, well, what do you think the book's about? And I would tell them. They'd say, how do you know that? And I said, I don't know that, but I know Alabama history. 1954, Brown v. Board of Education. 1955, the implementation of Brown v. Board of Education. December 1955, the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted until December 1956. During the time of that boycott, a pregnant African-American woman was shot by a sniper on a Montgomery public bus. 4 African-American churches, most Baptist, were bombed in Birmingham by white terrorists. The home of Martin Luther King Jr. was dynamited while his family was there, only barely missing killing all of them. In Birmingham, there were 33 racial bombings, mainly of African American ministers' houses, lawyers' houses, and even a Jewish synagogue between 1939 and 1963. During the period that she was writing Go Set a Watchman, the Alabama legislature met in its annual session and by a vote of 98-1 passed the Boutwell Amendment, which provided for the closing of all Alabama schools rather than the integration of any Alabama school. Rather to have a population ignorant than one attending school with African Americans. By 1956, there were 100,000 members of the White Citizens Council in Alabama, including the editor of the Alabama Lawyer, the major law journal in the state of Alabama, which had turned the law journal into a defense of massive resistance against integration. This is the best regarded lawyer in the state of Alabama who's doing that. As a result of that, many of the city councils, many of the county legislative bodies, and much of the Alabama legislature was dominated by the White Citizens Council. And if you were a businessman, a lawyer, a minister, a doctor, a professional person of any kind, even a college professor at an Alabama school, you either conceded the argument to the Citizens Council or you went perfectly silent. You could not continue a law practice in a small town in Alabama without either conceding the right of the Citizens Council to govern the town or by just keeping your mouth shut. However, if your daughter is 23 years old and up in New York City and being asked at cocktail parties, and where are you from, dear? And you say Alabama, and they say, oh, so sorry. And if you're reading about what is going on in Alabama, not in the Birmingham News or in the Monroe Journal, which incidentally was published by her father, AC Khalili, and was full of segregationist rant in the 1950s, written by her father, the real AC Khalili. So I had some idea what this book was going to be about. And I can tell you on the 14th of July, 2016, I was absolutely right. It was about exactly what I thought it would be about. A young woman, furious at her father, judgmental about her father, self-righteously going home to confront her father. Now, you remember in the arc of theology I mentioned about C.S. Lewis, we started with innocence. Perhaps the great humorist Oscar Wilde will be useful here. Oscar Wilde once wrote, "When we are young, our parents are perfect. Then we come to judge them. Rarely, if ever, do we learn to forgive them." Or to put it in another way, more appropriate for the handout I gave you, we leave home for lots of reasons. We leave home because little towns like Macomb are too confining, too parochial, not exciting enough, and we live our lives to be 18 so that we can leave. And we may leave just because there's nothing exciting happened, but there are much more profound and deeply troubling reasons we leave as well. As this story unfolded over the next 6 months before the publication of the novel in July, I thought about all the possible implications of the novel in terms of the religious and literary life of the state. For instance, I knew that Nell had submitted this book in January of 1957, and I knew that her agent, Maurice Crane, a fellow Southerner from Texas, had said, "Nell, this is just not your best writing, not what you're capable of." And her editor at Lippincott Publishers, a Jewish woman from New York by the name of Tay Hohoff, said, "America is not ready for this story. So why don't you take the brilliant characterizations of the three children and build a story around the three children as youngsters, not as adults, and in 1932 to 35, not in 1956. And so that is precisely what Nell did over the following 2 years. As a result of their advice, we have To Kill a Mockingbird, but remember that the book she wrote first, the book that was so compelling, the book that took over her life, was Go Set a Watchman. There's a new book on the New York Times bestseller list by Paul Kalanithi called When Breath Becomes Air. Paul Kalanithi was a neurosurgeon who died at the age of 37 just after finishing this quite brilliant book about philosophy and medicine and biology and literature at the age of 37. In the book, he writes, literature provides our richest material for moral reflection. Literature provides our best material for moral reflection. Think the Bible. Think Proverbs or Job or the Gospels. I think he's onto something here. And I think what we have in Go Set a Watchman is a moral tale that provides perhaps America's best reflection for moral values, particularly in the light of what happened in Charleston and the public policy debates in American politics in the presidential race. What could be more appropriate than a piece of literature that forces us to follow the moral arc of what happens in families, of people, and of nations? So here's the story in a nutshell. Jean Louise Finch, after 6 years in New York City, goes home to confront her father, her fiancé, Henry Clinton, and her town about race. When she arrives at home, she renews her relationship with her fiancé. They go skinny dipping in the Alabama River, for instance, and her father, in a moment of great humor, says, "I hope you didn't skinny dip facing the sky instead of the bottom of the river," which would, of course, give rise to considerable gossip in the little town of Macomb. Her father's like that, wonderfully loving even when she violates his moral norms, always forgiving of her, even when she left when he was in fact 70 and she was 23, and he worried so about her going to New York City. But in the most dramatic moment early in the book, young Jean Louise Finch hears that there is going to be a meeting and her father is going to be at the meeting. So she goes to the courthouse in Monroeville, Macomb, and she sits in the colored balcony, but this time she's not watching the trial of Tom Robinson. She's watching all the males of Macomb County gathered together in defense of their own sunny South, as a racist by the name of Grady O'Hanlon harangues them about the threat of blacks to the community of Macomb and how they're going to take over the county and run it because they have the majority and all they have to do is get registered to vote. And the White Citizens Council is going to protect Macomb and its women folk by preventing that from happening. Jean Louise Finch, 26, sits in the balcony, appalled at what she hears. And with your permission, I'm going to do something that probably no speaker much ever does here or anywhere else. I'm going to read to you. I know you're smart. You can read it yourselves. But my hunch is that not many of you have read. How many of you read Go Set a Watchman? Okay, 12, 15. I was right. One reason people are not reading it is because they say they're terribly disappointed in Atticus, the greatest hero, according to the American Film Institute of the History of American Cinema. In 2003, they voted his role as Atticus Finch, the greatest hero in the history of American cinema. So here's your hero. This scene, just after Jean Louise has seen her father perform, is a flashback to the father she once knew and thought was her father. Integrity, humor, patience, those were the three words for Atticus Finch. There was also a phrase for him: pick at random any citizen from Macomb County and its environs, ask him what he thought of Atticus Finch, and the answer would most likely be, I never had a better friend. Atticus Finch's secret of living was so simple, it was deeply complex. Where most men had codes and tried to live up to them, Atticus lived his to the letter with no fuss, no fanfare, and no soul searching. His private character was his public character. His code was simple New Testament ethic. Its rewards were the respect and devotion of all who knew him. Even his enemies loved him because Atticus never acknowledged they were his enemies. He was never a rich man, but he was the richest man his children ever knew. What stood behind her, the most potent moral force in her life, was the love of her father. She never questioned it, never thought about it, never even realized that before she made any decision of importance, the reflex, what would Atticus do, passed through her unconscious. She never realized what made her dig in her feet and stand firm whenever she did was her father. That whatever was decent and of good report in her character was put there by her father. She did not know that she worshiped him. That's the retrospective. That's what she's thinking as she wakes up the morning after witnessing his performance at the organizing meeting for the White Citizens Council. Finally, after some days, her father says, "What's wrong, Jean Louise?" And she lets him know. In what is undoubtedly one of the greatest fictional confrontations between a daughter and a father ever written. I heard something once. I heard a slogan, and it stuck in my head. I heard equal rights for all, special privileges for none. And to me, it didn't mean anything except exactly what it said. It didn't mean one card off the top of the deck for the white man and one off the bottom for the Negro. Let's look at it this way, said her father. You realize that our Negro population is backward, don't you? You will concede that. You realize the full implication of the word backward, don't you? Yes, sir. You realize that the vast majority of them here in the South are unable to share fully in the responsibilities of citizenship. And why? Think about this. Abbott County, over across the river, is in bad trouble. Population is 3/4 Negro. Voting population is almost half and half now because of that big normal school over there. If the scales are tipped over, what would you have? The county wouldn't keep a full board of registrars because if they registered the Negroes, the black vote would edge out the white, and you'd have Negroes in every office in that county. Jean Louise, I'm only trying to tell you some plain truths. You must see things as they are, not just the way you think they should be. Then why didn't you show me things as they really are when I was sitting in your lap as a little girl? Why didn't you show me? Why weren't you careful when you read me history and the things that I thought meant something to you? That there was a fence around everything marked whites only. Then let's put this on a practical basis, Jean Louise. Do you want Negroes by the carload in our schools, in churches, and theaters? Do you want them in our world? They're people, aren't they? We were quite willing to import them when they made money for us. We had them in our world then. Do you want your children going to a school that's been dragged down to accommodate Negro children? The scholastic level of that school down the street, Atticus, couldn't be any lower, and you know it. They're entitled to the same opportunities anyone else has. They're entitled to the very same chance. Honey, you do not seem to understand that the Negroes down here are still in their childhood as a people. You should know it. You've seen it all your life. They've made terrific progress in adapting themselves to white ways, but they're far from it yet. They were coming along fine, traveling at a rate they could absorb, more of them voting than ever before. Then the NAACP stepped in with its fantastic demands and shoddy ideas of government. Can you blame the South for resenting being told what to do about its own people by people who have no idea of its daily problems? How can you have grown up here, Jean Louise, led the kind of life you led, and can only see someone stop? Jean Louise, they're trying to wreck us. Where have you been? Right here in Macomb? What do you mean? I mean, I grew up right here in your house, and I never knew what was in your mind. I only heard what you said. You neglected to tell me that we were naturally better than the Negroes, bless their kinky little heads, that they were able to go so far, but so far only. You neglected to tell me what Mr. O'Hanlon said yesterday. That was really you talking down there. You just let Mr. O'Hanlon say it for you at the meeting. You're a coward as well as a snob and a tyrant. When you talked of justice, you forgot to say that justice is something that has nothing to do with people. I remember that rape case you defended, but I missed the whole point, didn't I? You love justice, all right, abstract justice, written down on your brief, item by item. It has nothing to do with that black boy on trial for his life. You just like a neat brief. Interfered with your orderly mind, and you had to work order out of disorder. It's a compulsion with you. And now it's coming home to you. And now she was on her feet, holding the back of her chair. Atticus, I'm throwing it at you, and I'm going to grind it in. You better go warn your younger friends that if they want to preserve our way of life, it begins at home. It doesn't begin with the schools or the churches or any place but home. Tell them that. And use your blind, immoral, misguided, nigger-loving daughter as your example. You can go in front of me with a bell and you can say, unclean. Point me out as your mistake. Point me out. Jean Louise Finch, who was exposed to all kinds of guff from white trash she went to school with, but she might never have gone to school for all the influence it had on her. Everything that was gospel to her, she got at home from her father. You sowed in me, Atticus, and now it's coming home to you. Are you finished with what you have to say? She sneered, not half through. I'll never forgive you for what you did to me. You cheated me, you've driven me out of my home, and now I'm in a no man's land but good. There's no place for me here in Macomb, and I'll never be entirely home anywhere else. Her voice cracked. God! And speaking of God, why didn't you make it plain to me that God made the races and to black folks in Africa with the intention of keeping them there so the missionaries could go tell them that Jesus loved them, but meant for them to stay in Africa. Us bringing them over here, that was our big mistake. So they're really to blame, the missionaries, that Jesus loved all mankind. But there are different kinds of men with separate fences around them, that Jesus meant that any man can go as far as he wants within his fence. Jean Louise, come down to earth. All right, I'll come down to earth. I'll land right in the living room of our home. I'll come down to you because I believed in you. I looked up to you, Atticus, like I never looked up to anybody in my life, and I'll never will again. If you had only given me some hint, if you had only broken your word with me a couple of times, if you had been bad-tempered or impatient with me, if you had been a lesser man, maybe I would have taken what I saw you doing yesterday. If once or twice you'd let me catch you doing something vile, then I would have understood yesterday. Then I'd have said, that's his way, that's just my man, because I'd have been prepared for what happened yesterday. You deny them hope. Any man in this world, Atticus, any man who has a head and arm and legs was born with hope in his heart. You won't find that in the Constitution. I picked up that in church one time. They're simple people, most of them, but that does not make them subhuman. You were telling them that Jesus loves them, but not much. You were using frightful means to justify ends that you think are good for most people. Your ends may be all right, but you cannot just use people as pawns, Atticus. There's no point in saying more to you, because I know you won't give an inch. You never will. You've cheated me in a way that is inexpressible, but don't let it worry you, because the joke is entirely on me. You're the only person I think I ever really trusted, and now I'm done for. I'll never trust anyone again. I've killed you, Scout, because I had to. Don't you give me any more of that double talk. You're a nice, sweet, old gentleman, and I'll never believe a word you say to me again. I despise you and everything you stand for. Well, I love you. Don't you dare say that to me. Love me, Atticus. I'm getting out of this place fast. I don't know where I'm going, but I'm going. I never want to see another Finch or hear of one as long as I live. As you please, Jean Louise. You double-dealing, ring-tailed old son of a bitch. You sit there and say, as you please, when you've knocked me down and you've stomped on me and you've spat on me, you just sit there and say, as you please. When everything I ever loved in this world, you just sit there and say, as you please, you love me. You son of a bitch. That'll do, Jean Louise. That'll do. His general call to order in the days when I still believed in him. So he kills me and gives it a twist. How can he taunt me so? How can he take me away from here? God in heaven, take me away. How's that? That's the reason one bookstore in Michigan offered refunds for anyone who brought Go Set a Watchman, because the Atticus here is not the Atticus they bought the book to find. But on the other hand, I would argue that's the real Atticus. The real man who was a lawyer in a small town during the Civil Rights era, who had to make a living, who had to run for political office, who served his county in the state legislature, who edited the town paper, and was the Methodist elder who would have never used the language you heard a minute ago, because he would have not thought that to be moral language. The reason I knew this story when I was talking with reporters is because this story is really as old as time, isn't it? It's as old as the Bible. It's about generations of self-righteous and judgmental young people sitting in judgment of parents who have to live within the reality of their culture, not the reality of the young person's culture at Campbell College or New York, where they're getting a different kind of understanding of morality and wisdom. It was the same kind of wisdom I had when I confronted my father at the age of 16. Would you believe it? In 1956, members of Parker Memorial Baptist Church, where 3 years later I would get my first job as minister of youth at my home church. And the conversation went something like this: Dad, I have something I need for you to explain to me. Our church supports missionary Christy Poole and his wife as missionaries to Ogbomoso, Nigeria, where they teach in the seminary and convert Nigerians to faith in Jesus Christ. And yet, if Christy Poole converts someone in Ogbomoso and they come to Anniston, Alabama, they will not be allowed to attend Parker Memorial Church. So explain to me why we should pay the salary of a missionary to convert people in Ogbomoso who can't come here and worship in our church. It's our tradition, Wayne. You just have to understand our tradition. No, Dad. No, Dad. Because I wear this bracelet that says WWJD, what would Jesus do? And I read the Gospels, and there's no way Jesus would do what Parker Memorial Baptist Church does. So how can we say this is just tradition? If you want to live here, Wayne, you have to understand who we are and the culture in which you will have to preach the gospel. And that was the first step as a young Baptist ministerial student that I took out of preaching the gospel in white churches in the South. That's where it began. I was a ministerial student at Howard College the next year when I was a freshman. And in 1960, I graduated in May from Howard College, and I returned to my home church as minister of youth. And that Mother's Day of May 2060 is when a group of 200 Ku Klux Klansmen in my hometown firebombed the first load of Freedom Riders into the Deep South. John Lewis was on the bus. If it had not been for the courage of an Alabama state trooper who pulled a pistol inside the bus and threatened to shoot anybody that came on board, they would have killed everyone on the bus with Molotov cocktails, which was their intent that day. And so I had this conversation with my father that sounded so much like the conversation Jean Louise Finch had with her father, that minus the vocabulary she used, which was not the vocabulary I used with my father, it could have been the same conversation. Nor was my father an evil man, not a member of the White Citizens Council, never a member of the Klan. As president of the Pinson Civitan Club, it was my father who refused to allow the Klan to hold a cross-burning and rally on the only property in town large enough for it, which was owned by the Civitan Club, resulting in one of the fourth graders of one of the members of the Klan telling my mother, who was his teacher, that her father and the Klan was going to burn a cross on their yard that night. So I know that my father was like Atticus Finch, basically a good man trapped within the culture of living within a racist society and facing America's original sin and trying to find out what to do about it. And so I went off to graduate school and decided that I could not preach at a Baptist church in the South because no white Baptist church would call me. And when I returned to Sanford to teach on the faculty of my alma mater in 1965, the very first thing I did in August of 1965 when I returned, the very month that Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, was to organize the first voting registration drive for African Americans in the Rosedale community. And the next year, a group of students from the Baptist Student Union and the Student Education Association and the Young Democrats organized the first tutoring program at Rosedale High School, which resulted in the first black African American co-ed who came to Sanford in 1969. Or in other words, like Jean Louise, fighting the culture from which you came because I didn't want to leave it, and if I stayed, I had to fight to change it. I tell you that very personal story because there is a wonderful humorist here in North Carolina during my youth by the name of Harry Golden. Harry Golden published a wonderful newspaper called the Carolina Israelite. Have you ever heard of a better title for a newspaper than the Carolina Israelite? He, like me and like Jean Louise, was very much at war with his culture. And in one of his most poignant and powerful editorials in the mid-1950s, yes, when I was having a conversation with my father and Nell was writing Go Set a Watchman, he wrote these words about North Carolina. No state can long progress which exiles its prophets and exalts its fools. Want me to run that by you again? No state can long progress which exiles its prophets and exalts its fools. So you know what a lot of the prophets do? They leave home. They leave home. Now I've told you 3 stories. Story number 1. Nell Harper Lee has a real issue about race with her real father, AC Khalili, who publishes the Monroe Journal and practices law and supports segregation. And I've told you a fictional story about Jean Louise Finch because Nell didn't want to write a memoir about her confrontation with her father, so she hid it within fiction, and that's called Go Set a Watchman. And it's Jean Louise Finch confronting Atticus Finch, no longer the perfect man, no longer the one that confronted his community for its racism and triumphed over it in his personal conscience. That's not the Atticus Finch there. Then the conversation I had with my father, that's the 3rd episode. Now, the postscript. Dear God, take me out of here. Dear God, take me away. Well, God took my son away. My son, as Brad suggested, married sisters. The sisters were from Morris, Alabama, coal camp. They went to a public high school in Morris, and they went to Samford University, as did my younger son. My older son went to Auburn and was an aerospace engineer, a jet pilot, and then took a 2nd degree in software design at Pasadena School of Design, and went to work with Microsoft and worked for Microsoft for 10 years before he went to work as the director of software development for a Precor exercise fitness equipment company, an international corporation headquartered in Seattle. And when I retired from Auburn, my wife and I were out for a trip to visit our 2 grandchildren, and I just suggested in passing that David might want to think about coming south. We're getting old. It'd be nice to see our grandkids. They'd be nearer if we got old and needed them. And I said, you know, there are all sorts of great software companies. Atlanta's full of them. Research Triangle is loaded with them. Atlanta's got them. Charleston's got them. Tampa City's got them. They're all over the place. You can find a great job. And, you know, you've built this software design team from just you to 36 people, and you're making all sorts of money for the company. I know you could get a great job in the South. Dad, we're not interested in coming south. I misunderstood his response, and I said, but some of these are world-class companies. He said, no, Dad, it's not about the companies. It's about the South. We don't want our son educated in the South. We don't want our daughter in the South. We don't want to live in Alabama, where Roy Moore is the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. We have left home. Seattle is our home. Interesting. I'll bet if this is a typical audience, I could find somebody else here who's had the same experience. I bet you there are an awful lot of kids from Raleigh and maybe 100 miles every direction who've just said, I'm done with this. I don't know what they are. And I don't know if they're Jewish and don't want to stay, or whether they're Hispanic and don't want to stay, or Asian American and don't want to stay, or gay and don't want to stay, or what they are and don't want to stay. I'm just saying, that Harry Golden was right. No state, not even North Carolina, will long progress that exiles its prophets and exalts its fools. And the conversation that Go Set a Watchman forces us to have in America may well be as far ahead of its time in 2016 as it was in 1960. Questions? Vilification? Outrage? Go home to Alabama and preach to your own people? Questions? We've allocated 15 minutes for this. So, first question, if this is a typical class, is the hardest one. Glenn, there you got one.
Dr. Flynt, thank you for sharing your evening with us tonight. I have two questions for you. First of which is, what impact do you think Truman Capote's friendship with her had on her writing? And second of all, what was her opinion on Thomas Wolfe?
There's two great questions, and I'll take the first one first because I have no idea. But in the handout I gave you, I did mention the fact that in literature, this is a really important thing, as is also, as you know, the idea of the hero who goes out in the world. Joseph Campbell's great book about hero mythology. You go on a journey, and out there in that world, you find something really important about your home, and you try to go home. And this is James Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. It's Marianne Robinson's brilliant new book, Home. So it's a wonderful theme that combines all of them. Truman Capote I know a lot about. Truman was her best friend. They shared a Chinaberry tree. He was 18 months older than she, and totally abandoned by his mother and father, and raised by his Falk relatives next door to them. As he himself said, he had almost total recall, and even as a very young kid, he was writing. And she was probably greatly influenced by the fact he kept a notebook and he would write things, and she got an old Underwood typewriter from her father, and she began to type what he wrote. And so they're playing in the treehouse. They're there for months at a time, during the summers especially. She loved Truman Capote. I don't mean that in a romantic or sexual way, because as you know, he's a flamboyant gay. But she loved Truman Capote. There's no doubt about it. Truman Capote had published Other Voices, Other Rooms in 1948, which was a sensational seller in the Northeast mainly. He invited her to leave law school at the University of Alabama, where she was very unhappy anyway, and join her, which she did just about the time he left with Jack Dunphy, his partner, and went to Italy for 10 years. So one part of the answer is not a lot of direct influence, and this really deals with the persistent rumor which Truman actually contributed to by some of his drug-induced gossip toward the end of his life, that he wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, because he never won the Pulitzer Prize and he never won the National Book Award. And after 1965, when In Cold Blood, which he was just convinced was going to win both, and probably should have won both, frankly. In Cold Blood is just absolutely brilliant. It creates a whole new genre of literature. And when he did not win both, their relationship begins to fracture. About that same time, he broke up with Jack Dunphy. He becomes promiscuous. He begins to use drugs heavily. He uses alcohol heavily. And Nell can't stand to see somebody she loves self-destruct. So their relationship after that's pretty much ended. She has tremendous influence on him, and though you may not know it, and the world certainly doesn't know it, but she actually wrote in 1973 an In Cold Blood kind of book called The Reverend, about a black minister who took out insurance policies on 4 of his relatives, all of whom died suddenly, and who was accused of murder and was shot to death by the uncle of his last victim at the funeral of the victim. And I know the book was finished because my wife and I were told by Louise Connor, her sister, that she had finished the book on the dining room table in her house in Eufaula, Alabama. And she said, I read it, and it was better than To Kill a Mockingbird and better than In Cold Blood. So that later stage of Nell's life is dramatically influenced by Truman. Where that manuscript is and whether we will ever see it again, I do not know. But then we didn't think there was another book. We didn't know there was a Go Set a Watchman either, did we? So maybe it's out there somewhere. In terms of characterization, she wasn't much influenced by him, and all you have to do is read To Kill a Mockingbird or Go Set a Watchman, which is singularly her voice, or if you want to go to the University of Alabama and read her articles in the Rammer Jammer Humor magazine or Crimson and White, that's not Truman Capote's voice. It never was. Even when she was a young woman, you could hear her voice just as clearly as you read it in To Kill a Mockingbird.
Another question?
Well, I'll be more than glad to stay around until about 8:45 to chat with you.
Dr. Flynt will be signing books back here, and let me also let you know that Dr. Flynt's wife, Darty, is here with us as well. I hope you will say a kind word to her as well. She's sitting right over here on my left. Thank you for your presence tonight. Remember, tomorrow night is going to be a very special conversation between Dr. Creed and Dr. Flynt. Same time, same place here in Butler Chapel. That will take place as the second event with Dr. Flynt. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
I'll shake your hand. I work here. This is my daughter, Rachel.
Rachel, it's so nice to meet you.
Rachel is a freshman major here. Aspiring writer.
In another life, I would have been a novelist, and Nell would have been a social historian.